Hello and welcome to the home of the Ghost Owl as we continue our look at the Warhammer The Old World rulebook. And yes, we are not that far away from the end of the book. And today we're going to be looking at putting together, mustering a Warhammer army. So let's have a look. So points value. Agree the points value before the game that you want to play with your opponent. And I've highlighted a few here. So 1,250 to 1,500 points is a really good starting place for beginners, particularly if you've gone into the Bretonnian or Tomb King's box or the future boxes that come out, because they seem to be in and around that, 1,250 points. 1,500 is nice because it normally allows you to then add like some extra unit to cover some other part of the game. But it's if you want a short game, it's obviously a good points value because the smaller the points value, the shorter the game in general. But that's definitely a good points value for people that are new to the rules, because it will take you quite a long time to learn, go backwards and forwards to the book. So 2,000 points, that's typically been your average points value. A game like that is typically going to last a couple of hours to someone that knows the rules pretty well. What we are seeing of is this whole 1999 plus one thing, which is we've seen it proposed for tournaments and stuff like that, and that's because of the limits that are imposed upon, for example, one dragon for every 1,000 points. Well, by doing this means you don't get that second dragon at the 2,000 point mark. This is very specific, right? I'm not sure I would encourage that type of play for the casual stuff. I get where they're coming from in terms of tournament play and things being wildly skewed. In theory, if dragons are that powerful, then they should be they should be either nerfed or they should have a massive points increase. Remains to be seen how active Games Workshop is going to be in terms of updating the game. But I can see where people are coming from, but I don't really like the way it's done. 2,500 points. So that is, for me, is if I've got an afternoon, is like an ideal points value for me for a classic rank and file Warhammer style game. It's enough points where you feel like you've got a full army, you've got a varied army, that having your two dragons, there's 500 points on top of that, where there's other stuff on the board. You can fit in your war machines and your wizards and everything else. So I really like 2,500 points personally. For me, that's an absolute sweet spot for the game. And to be honest, it doesn't take that much longer than a 2,000 point game. 3,000 points, that's a game that is a whole afternoon into an evening potentially. Great, obviously, in terms of casual games. You're not going to be doing this typically on a pickup game at a local club or game store or something. But, this is where you sort of got grand clashes. This sort of points levels are really good for things like narrative battles and campaign battles as well, because it allows you a lot more flexibility with what you're picking. Okay, so minimum of 3 non-character units, excluding the troop type of swarm, war beasts, and war machines. That is what is required to create an army, and you must include at least 1 character. Now, every time that you build an army, typically you write this down on a piece of paper. That is essentially your muster list. And ideally, this sort of thing that, you want to make clear to yourself. And the more information you put on your muster list, the less times you're going to be diving back into the main rulebook, potentially, or your faction rulebook. And if you're going to a tournament, of course, you will have to have a very specific, very nicely laid out army list or muster list for submission to the tournament. Now, army composition list. So there are 2 types. The first type is the default list for each faction. It's called the Grand Army Composition List. This is what you find in books like the army list for the Force of Evil, the Ravening Hordes, and the Force of Fantasy one. So You know, those are the generic grand army lists. And then you've got these more specific armies of infamy composition lists. These are found in the arcane journals. And that's where you've got things like, you know, the Bretonnians being able to field the exiled lord who can get access to artillery things. It's like a weird and very specialized army list, and it does move things around. But Grand Army is the default. And that's what most people are probably going to be playing most of the time. Now, within your army composition, there are 4 main categories. That's characters. So for those of you that have come from previous editions, characters and heroes used to be separate. It's now just characters. Then you've got your core. These are generally your basic troops, the most common troops that you would see for that faction on the battlefield. Special, these are your sort of more elite infantry, elite cavalry, or more specialized units, war machines, beasts, and so on. And then you've got rare. These are the things that, you know, you're only really ever going to see 1 or 2 of in an army. And, you know, they're highly specialized, you know, that sort of thing. So, you know, and given the points limits, you're not going to be fielding too many of the rare units, and that's exactly right. That's the point of them, is that they are rarely seen on the battlefield. You've also got 2 additional categories, which are mercenaries and allies, which we'll come on to. Okay, so an army composition list is generally made up based upon percentage limits. So if we take a 2,000 point grand army, now here you get characters up to 50%. That means of your 2,000 point army, up to 1,000 points can be spent on characters. In terms of core, you must at least have 25% of your army be core units. So that's in a 2,000 point army, that's at least 500 points. You can have up to 50% of special units. You can have up to 25% of rare units. So that rare there, as I said, they are rare units. So you get up to 500 points. Now, typically rare units, also quite expensive on points, especially if they're like monsters and so on. So you're only ever really going to be fielding, you know, 1, 2, 3 at the most rare units. And those rare units, when you're fielding more, tend to be the cheaper war machines as opposed to the monsters. You can have up to 20% of mercenaries, and you can have up to 25% of allies. However, that can only be a single contingent. So you could only have a single contingent of allies. So an empire army, for example, could only have a single contingent of dwarfs. They couldn't have some dwarfs and some elves. Now, often you will see in the composition list number of units. So 0 to 1 or 0 to 2, for example, means you don't have to take any, but you can take a maximum of 2. You've got 1+, which means you must take at least 1 of that unit, though you may take more. And then you can see up to a number per 1,000 points. We kind of touched on that before. So a dragon, for example, you might see up to 1 per 1,000 points. So for every 1,000 points in your army, you can have 1 of that unit type. Named characters are unique, and you can therefore only include 1 of each army. So those of you playing 2 kings, there is only 1 Cetra. You cannot field 2 of them as much as you might want to. Mercenaries then. So mercenaries, they gain the mercenaries special rule, and prior to deployment you roll a d6 for each mercenary unit. On a 2+, they will act as normal. However, if you do roll a 1, you will have to consult the misbehaving mercenary table. If you roll a 1, your unit will become stupid and have a +1 modifier on the stupid test. 2 to 3, you get a -1 modifier to movement and initiative for the duration of battle. 4 to 5, they must be in reserve. They gain the ambusher's special rule, but they can only arrive if you roll a 6 on turn 2, turn 3, and on is normal. If you roll a 6, it's a -1 modifier to leadership for the duration of the battle. I have to say, with, okay, it's only a 2+, but the risks of having some of these issues hit your mercenary units, you do kind of think man, you've really got to want that mercenary unit. I honestly don't see in competitive play you're going to see much of the allies or mercenaries due to their limitations and some of the issues with them, and we'll see that on the allied units. So overall, in competitive play, you're not going to see it, but in narrative play and campaign play, it's quite possible, because generally there are obviously good narrative reasons to have mercenaries or allied units. Okay, so allied contingents then. Allied contingents are essentially a mini army within the larger army itself. Must include at least one character to act as its general. They must include at least one non-character unit, but there is no upper limit other than the points values. Special rules. So allied units can only be joined by allied unit characters. Allied characters can only join allied units. So no dwarf king leading unit of greatswords, for example. Cannot use inspiring presence or hold your ground from the main army general or the battle standard bearer. The main army faction specific rules do not apply to the allied contingent, and the allied army faction specific rules do not apply to the main army. And that's one of the interesting things I was saying about why we, having allies can be a bit of a liability, because you're building in a competitive army, you're looking for those synergies, you're looking for your special rules to benefit as many units as possible, and you're going to have to be very careful with allied units about those synergies. I'm sure there's a few out there. Players are amazing at finding all these little things, so I'm sure there's a few out there, but in general, there are some clear negatives in that. Okay, for all other purposes, allied contingents are considered to be part of the main army. Now, there are two other types here where you get uneasy allied contingents and special allied contingents. So an uneasy allied contingent has everything we just talked about from the normal special rules, plus the allied contingent is considered by the main army to have the levies rule, and uneasy allied units are not considered to be friendly by wizards belonging to the main army for the purpose of spell targeting. So you cannot use your wizards to buff those allied units if it's an uneasy allied contingent. You then have suspicious allied contingents, which have all the rules, special rules as normal for allied contingents, and uneasy allied contingents, and should a suspicious allied contingent flee through a main army unit, or vice versa, the fleeing unit must take a perils test. And suspicious allied contingent has a -1 modifier to leadership when within 6 inches of main army unit, and vice versa. So I really don't think that taking suspicious allied contingents, unless for narrative or campaign purposes, is a good idea at all. Okay. Finally, as we move then into, we're going to be looking at regimental units and detachments. So some units can be supported by up to 2 smaller units. The main unit requires the regimental special rule, and the supporting unit requires the detachment special rule. There are some units that can have both regimental and detachment special rules, but at the beginning of the game you must choose which they are, and obviously identify that on your muster list. A detachment must contain at least 5 models and be a maximum of half the size of the regimental unit. Detachments can purchase upgrades as normal, and a detachment cannot include a command group, so something to think about there. A detachment must accompany and be assigned to a regimental unit, but cannot be assigned to 2 units. Detachments are completely separate and independent from the regimental unit for the purpose of spells, magic items, and other special rules that are unit-wide unless specified otherwise. Detachments are normal units with the exception of the special rules below. So just before we move on to that, so just a good example, and a traditional example was having things, the Empire was well known for the regimental units and detachment rules, for example, so unit of great swords or a unit of halberdiers would have detachments of handgunners, crossbowmen beside them, so they can give them supporting fire and so on. And we're going to come on to some of those rules. But, you know, that's a good example of a big unit of infantry supported by a 1 or 2 smaller units of missile troops would be a common thing to see. So regimental units and detachments. Then the detachment special rules. So regimental deployment. Detachments must be deployed within 3 inches of the assigned regimental unit, and if one of them is held in reserve, both must be in reserve. So you can't have the regimental unit in reserve and the detachment on the table, and vice versa. Must be deployed within 3 inches of each other. Regimental leadership. Unless the regimental unit is fleeing, the detachment may use the regimental leadership if within 3 inches. However, if the detachment's leadership is higher, it can use that instead. Regimental psychology. If a regiment has frenzy, hatred, immune to psychology, or stubborn, it will confer these same rules to the detachment while that detachment is within 3 inches. So it could be a good thing. Supporting actions. If a regimental unit is charged and does not flee, detachments within 3 inches that are not in combat or fleeing themselves may declare a supporting action. And this is where you've kind of got a much more common thing. So supporting fire, this is the one that I certainly know the best in terms of with an Empire army. So you get a stand and shoot charge reaction as if it were the charge target. So you're the enemy, you're looking at this big unit of greatswords, they're a big threat and you want to take them down, so you want to charge to greatswords. But to do so, you might have to withstand a stand and shoot charge reaction from the 2 units of handgunners on either side, which can be a daunting prospect. So that's where you can get some great things there. Supporting charge, a detachment may make 1 out of sequence charge against 1 enemy unit that charged the regiment at the end of the charge moves subphase. So, you know, the missile troops aren't the only supporting detachment. You know, you might have a missile unit with some supporting troops, and you know, if they get charged, then at least you can charge the enemy with that potentially in the flank. So, you know, you can definitely help out units that way. But so, regimental units and detachments are a good thing. You know, there are limitations. It does limit some of the mobility because, of course, you've got to stay within 3 inches of each other. But there are some good benefits that go with it as well. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. That brings us to the end of just looking at putting together a Warhammer army. I know for many of you, this is going to be absolutely day 1, week 1 basic information. But there are some unique things in there, particularly when you start looking at things like allies and mercenaries. And also the fact that, you know, even if you played before, characters and heroes, don't get caught out by that one. They're just characters now. So hopefully it was useful to everyone out there. And if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Let me know why in the comments down below. And as always, if you want to see more content, hit the subscribe button. Free for you to do. Takes a few seconds for you to do, and is a massive, massive deal for me. So I really, really appreciate it. And thank you to all those that have subscribed already. It is very much appreciated. You've been watching The Ghost Owl, and I'll see you all very, very soon.